Good evening. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's debate, L'Shem Shomayim. My name is Rabbi Binyamin Blau, as you see by the tag, Rabbi Binny Blau, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the moderator to tonight's debate. Our evening has really two objectives. On the one hand, our objective is a debate L'Shem Shomayim. The RCA has tried to show that individuals can engage in a passionate discussion about issues in a way that really is reflective of their beliefs, their ideals, at the same time do so, and really respect one another. I want to thank, at the outset, Rabbi Chaim Strauchler, who really created this program, and of course from Daniel Karapkin, the president of the RCA, who spearheaded it and championed it. And so far, we've done two of these such events, and they've been extremely successful. So that's one objective, to be a model for what civil discourse can be like in our society, something that's sorely missing in the modern age. And in that sense, we're very fortunate that I have two chaverim, two personal friends of mine, Rabbi Efrem Goldberg and Rabbi Kornblau, both who I've worked together professionally and personally for many, many years, who I have the greatest admiration for, and more deeply, I know they have an admiration for each other. And I know, therefore, be able to engage in our discussion in a manner that will be l'kavod u'tiferes, that really show what a debate L'Shem Shomayim should be like. So I said that's the primary objective on the one hand. But there's a very worthwhile topic on the other hand, and that's the topic of should a rabbi tell Jews whom they should vote for? Both Rabbis Goldberg and Rabbi Kornblau wrote pieces about this very topic prior to the election. Rav Barry, and I'll refer to him this evening, wrote why Orthodox Jews should vote for Joe Biden. And Rav Efrem Goldberg wrote, as an Orthodox rabbi, I will not tell you how to vote, and neither should anyone else. So both of them have addressed the topic, but we felt that it's such an important discussion, we wanted to share it with you. So now I'm going to turn to my two presenters, again, my two good chaverim, and I'll turn to you, Rav Efrem, and ask the question, should a rabbi tell Jews whom they should vote for? Rav Efrem, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Blau. Thank you for moderating tonight, and thank you for your friendship always. And I echo the thanks to Rabbi Strauchler, Rabbi Karapkin, and the RCA for hosting this. I think more than ever, we need to hopefully try to model and learn from others about how to disagree agreeably. So I want to begin by saying that I'd love to change the name from a debate, a machlokas L'Shem Shomayim, to a discussion L'Shem Shomayim. A debate suggests a winner and a loser, that one defeats the other. The pundits always follow up a debate by trying to determine, holding up their scorecards. And Rav Barry is a good friend and a colleague, and we have different points of view that are legitimate and reasonable. And we're here to have a discussion L'Shem Shomayim, not so much a debate. And I think that before anything else is so important, particularly the parshios that we're about to start reading. But Yosef and his brothers, lo yochlu dabro l'shalom, they couldn't even speak to one another. Afilu l'shalom, they couldn't even give each other a shalom aleichem. And we're living in such a politically polarized world that people position the other as the adversary, the opposite. You voted for who? How? What? You're a self-hating. You don't care as much as I do. And lo yochlu dabro l'shalom, people are even unable to give a shalom aleichem. And I know that Rav Barry, and I'm sure he'll address this tonight, felt that people who were voting in a certain direction, particularly within the Orthodox community, had no voice, that others wouldn't give them a shalom aleichem. And others, on the other hand, feel that as well. So I think it's important to state at the outset that tonight is not, and if you tuned in to watch a ruthless debate with scorecards afterwards, it's not the case. It's hopefully going to be a meaningful discussion of two friends who have different points of view on an important topic. Every election is the most important election of our generation. In fact, articles came out before this one that are tracing headlines in newspapers for the last many decades and beyond that show that before every election, it is presented as the most important election of our time. When was it not? Click on news at the news archive shows that. And people will say, well, this election, the stakes are so high, higher than ever. So much is on the ballot, be it character, healthcare, the pandemic, Iran, Israel, economy, be it no shortage of issues. It's all on the ballot. And so again, I ask, when was an election not of enormous consequence? When were we able to say that it doesn't really matter? Every election is, and every election, one would argue that this is the most important election, and that's why this candidate is most aligned with not my values, God's values. This is most aligned with our Torah values. And to suggest that you could possibly endorse or vote for the other, normally I wouldn't say anything, but this election and these candidates, I have no choice. And I think the first point I want to make is that living under the microscope of the particular election, with the lens zoomed in, we feel that with every election, but we feel that's sorry with that particular election, but that argument could be made with every election. And I don't think that this one was an exception. And I think it would take truly extraordinary policy advocacy that would cross a line for us to cross our line, what I think should be our line as rabbis, of not endorsing public opinions. There are exceptions, and maybe this will come up in our conversation. In England last year, there was an exception where Chief Rabbi Mervis and even Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, came out, which was uncharacteristic and historical for them to do. But I think it's very instructive to note that they did not come out and endorse, to the best of my knowledge, a candidate. They didn't endorse Johnson, but rather they highlighted the anti-Semitic positions and anti-Semitic character of a candidate. And even when they thought that they had to deviate from their normal behavior and come out and weigh in on an election, they didn't do so by endorsing candidate. They didn't tell the people, the Jews of the United Kingdom, who they can or must vote for. They pointed out about one of the candidates certain flaws that they thought were so beyond the pale that they came out in order to be able to do so. Now, this election that we just had, and every election, shapes the character of a nation. And there are meaningful policy implications and consequences, as I said, and we always feel that we need to. Well, these policies have Torah sources. The Torah has what to say. Halacha, Jewish law, have what to say. Hashkafa, Jewish philosophy, has what to say. Who better to communicate what Torah, Halacha, and Hashkafa have to say on issues than rabbis? But here's where I come out. If the Torah has 70 faces to interpret Torah, and Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, when it comes to halacha, matters of Jewish law, even issues of life and death, we have legitimate and reasonable different positions that we both feel are okay, then why, when it comes to politics, do we not believe that there is the possibility of different reasonable and legitimate approaches? And once we understand as rabbis that there are different reasonable and legitimate approaches on policy among candidates and parties, then who and are we and why would we weigh in to tell anyone what they must believe? And so really I want to formulate my argument in three ways. Or Binny, you will indicate to me when I'm running out of time, and I hope that despite Rav Barry having a picture of your father behind him, you will indicate to him when he runs out of time as well. So the 3 points I want to make are: number one, who made us rabbis smarter when it comes to politics? We're not pundits, we're not necessarily better read, we're not necessarily more sophisticated, and we are not positioned to give conclusive instruction on which candidate is best, will be best, and who everybody should vote for. What I think we are positioned and empowered and obligated to do is to formulate what Torah values are. So to speak about the religious significance, if we believe that, as I think we all do, of the state of Israel, of caring about and advocating for the U.S.-Israel relationship, of combating anti-Semitism, even if we want to discuss, which I think is also dangerous territory to enter, because I think they're hot-button issues that the words themselves are politically driven, but even if we want to talk about immigration, or we want to talk about climate, or we want to talk about those things, I think that we as rabbis have a responsibility to talk about them in the context of Torah values, but stopping short of saying, therefore, whom to vote for. Our mispalalim, our congregants, our neighbors and our friends may be smarter than us, maybe better read than us, maybe more sophisticated than we are. We should remind them what the Torah counts on as the most important values, and then trust them. Trust that they have the judgment to determine which candidate, in their opinion and based on their background and through the filter and lens of their life, thinks will best execute and follow through and stand up for those values. Our responsibility is not to shy away from what Torah values are. We should put it out there and let our members and let the Jewish world take it, process it, digest it, and come to the conclusion based on their own thought about who will best be able to align themselves and best be able to execute and fulfill those values. Number two, as rabbis, there's enormous risk in taking public positions endorsing candidates or parties. And the enormous risk is that while we'll get a big yasher koach, a pat on the back, in the echo chamber of our community who will agree with us, and it will tell us how important it is to speak out, and why these times are unparalleled and unprecedented. But there's a segment of our community, and in some cases the minority, in some cases more than that, who will be alienated, who will be driven away, who will feel so distanced from our taking that public position. So much so that maybe they have some guidance they need from us, some counsel they want from us, a psak in Jewish law they want, but now they challenge our judgment. Now they question that we're really similar, or that we can have a relationship, or that our answer will resonate for them, because if we can be so sure on politics in a different way than them, we run an enormous risk, I think, of alienating people. But more than running the risk of alienating the people with whom we're supposed to be close and supposed to dedicate our lives in areas that are much more important, they don't need us for politics. They can read and watch and post and click and forward and share politics, but they need us for so much more. And we can be cutting off that channel to be there for them in those ways if we enter the fray of politics. But more than that, we run the risk of someone in shul saying, the rabbi's on my side. The rabbi sees it my way. And they can weaponize that against a friend, against a fellow congregant. We now can be used, we can be abused, because someone will say, you see, the rabbi agrees you have to vote this way, otherwise X, Y, or Z. And so in a polarized world, we're contributing to the divisiveness and the polarization if we publicly take side. And I think the likelihood that we're going to change minds or opinions is very small. The greater likelihood is that we'll alienate and further polarize. But I have a third opinion. Rabbi Binny, do I have time for one more?
One more.
The third and final reason for why I think it's a mistake for rabbis to publicly endorse candidates, not to shy away from the important issues and policies, but to endorse candidates, is, and this is a little bold, and I will say it in an exaggerated fashion, we are supposed to be beacons of emunah and bitachon. We are supposed to demonstrate the humility to say, I don't and I can't ever understand or predict everything. It's a complicated world around me. I don't know why it happens the way it does. Harbe shluchim lamakom. Hashem has a lot of agents and sends a lot of people to do his bidding. And we don't know the divine scheme of who is supposed to win. Now we have to take our initiative. I voted. I got my proud sticker election day, and I voted because I believe it's a civic duty. I believe it's a responsibility to vote. We have to take our ishtadlus, our initiative to vote. But beyond personally voting, taking a public stance as if we're telling people you must vote or should vote in this way because we know who will be best, how do we truly know? How do we truly know? Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of all men, didn't. Palgei Mayim Lev Melech Biyad Hashem. He understood that ultimately Hashem is the one who fashions, and therefore Al Tiftechu B'Nedivim, and we shouldn't have overconfidence in ourselves. We should demonstrate the humility to say, I'm considering the issues, here's what I care about, here are the variables that will enter into how I make my decision. It's a personal decision, I'll share it with you privately and personally, not as a rabbi, and I trust you to make your decision. I make it with humility, I make it with hope, but I don't make it with any sense of certainty or confidence.
Thank you, Rav Efrem, for your impassioned and cogent presentation. Rav Barry asked you the same question. Should a rabbi tell Jews whom they should vote for?
It's a pleasure to be on this panel with you, Rav Efrem, Rav Binny, with Rabbi Strauchler, and for organizing the innumerable hours that I worked on projects with all of you and other RCA Rabbanim on the staff of the RCA is a constant source of strength and inspiration for me. Tonight's debate about rabbinic electoral endorsement is really about a horse that long ago left the barn. Every week, rabbis publish widely read, openly partisan columns about politics, candidates, and elections. Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson led a multi-million-dollar re-election fundraiser, which Trump attended. A group of Israeli religious Zionist rabbis, a group of American Haredi rabbis, the head of Ner Yisrael, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, and innumerable others all publicized their support for Trump in this election. The list goes on. I agree that as a general rule, rabbis not endorse candidates for many of the reasons that I've stated and written about. I publicly stated my own reasons for that general rule in a New York Jewish Week interview a few weeks back. They largely relate to rabbis' roles in their local communities. And that's also why, during the past 2 decades as a rabbi, I had never before endorsed a presidential candidate until this past October. I'm getting slight feedback. Are you hearing that also?
Yes.
I'm sorry about that.
Take a moment. Don't worry. I timed Rav Efrem. We're on good timing. We won't include this in your time. Take a moment. After all, as Rav Efrem said, it's not a debate; it's a discussion. So it's fine.
I don't have another device, so I don't know what I could be echoing from. But okay, we'll have to just keep on going. But as I was saying, just as other rules have exceptions, this general principle simply cannot be absolute. There's a time to remain silent and a time to speak. As Rav Efrem points out, for the Chief Rabbi of Britain and the organized Jewish community of Great Britain, the moment came last year. But I believe that every person, every American, every Jew, every rabbi, every Queen Esther knows that there's a mi yodea im la'et kazot higat l'malchut moment, when one feels obligated to take a strong public stand, whether for or against the candidate or an office holder. For some, that time may never come, but I believe that when push comes to shove, almost all of us can imagine such a moment. And so I think that the real question is, under what circumstances a rabbi should take a position in an election. Having defined it, I'm not really going to answer it, because I don't think a generally applicable rule for rabbinic political speech exists. I certainly don't know one other than to use one's best judgment, giving due consideration to a wide range of complex factors, many of which, on the no side, Efrem elucidated so well. Instead, I'll provide 6 answers to a question that I can answer. Why did I, after 2 decades of not endorsing presidential candidates, publish a 4,500-word essay and then a follow-up piece advocating that Jews, especially Orthodox ones, support Joe Biden for president? Why did I think that this election required an exception? Well, I agree with Rav Efrem. One thing is for sure, that in the current political environment, I certainly did not act under the illusion that my writing would change many minds. The first reason I spoke as a rabbi was to provide a Torah counterweight to the one-sided and overwhelming support for Trump and the corresponding denigration of political liberals that for years has been palpable throughout our Orthodox world. Beyond the long list of rabbinical endorsements I already mentioned, this one-sided reality is ironically reflected even in the odd imbalance of tonight's panel on whether rabbis should endorse candidates. Why are none of the many pro-Trump RCA Rabbanim who openly and unabashedly support Trump, why aren't they here to say, of course, yes? And an obvious answer is that hearing tonight from yet another Orthodox rabbi touting Trump's accomplishments, or saying that Joe Biden is beholden to the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic defund the plus socialist squad-loving left, that would have been a big ho-hum. We hear it all the time. But hearing from an RCA rabbi who openly supported a Democrat, supported Biden, now that is a chiddush. Week after month after year, the assumption, expectation, sometimes even the demand of support for Trump has been manifest throughout much of our community. It's in our shuls, our kiddushes, our Shabbos tables, and the emails, WhatsApps, and social media discussions among community and family members. It's splashed across the publication websites that cater to and in many ways represent our community. At the leadership level, too, rabbis, leaders, and institutions across the Orthodox spectrum have made their Trump in this election for support for Trump clear. Others are more subtle than flat-out endorsements. They'll say, a frum Jew has a chiyuv to show hakaras hatov to our revered president, as one recently put it, or here are the candidates I plan to vote for, said another publicly. When a Gouda suddenly advertises to its Georgia parishioners, register to vote because the fate of the Senate depends on your votes, there's no need for them to specify which candidates they want you to vote for, because it's already perfectly clear. And even rabbis and institutions who profess political neutrality make their views clear in other ways, by jokes told and assumptions made, by the choices of which issues to discuss and not discuss, by those given a platform to speak and those not handed the mic. Who is within and who is without who is beyond the pale? Is Ben Shapiro in or is he out? Similarly, when a rabbi frames a decision whether to support Trump as all the good he's done versus a relatively minor flaw such as his uncouth rhetoric and pomposity, this framing itself communicates his view that Trump's actual policies and the real damage they've caused to real people in the real world are of relatively small consequence. Extreme demonstrations of loyalty to a political candidate never happened in our community for other candidates. Yet with rabbinic participation and approval for Trump, we've had parades through major Orthodox communities, popular from singers rallying entire summer camps in pro-Trump songs, and a well-known Orthodox synagogue organization turning its annual fundraising dinner into a MAGA rally. Summing it up in the Lakewood Scoop, PR and professional pro and political pro Ezra Friedlander wrote that some pro-Trump behavior in the Orthodox community this past year was, to use his words, cult-like behavior, reminiscence of demagoguery, messianic, framing the president in idolatrous proportions, to the point where the image of our community being led by and consisting of active proponents of such idolatry became widespread. Those are strong words. Friedlander added that this inhibited Trump's followers from assessing his opponent, Joe Biden, and hence my article. Indeed, a teacher of American civics and history in a Brooklyn yeshiva wanted to present an Orthodox Jewish case for Biden to his students. He told me that my article was the only one that he could find. And this brings me to a second reason why I wrote as a Jewish leader: the need to demonstrate to the Biden campaign, what is now the incoming Biden administration, and the Democratic Party as a whole, that they have true outspoken friends in our Orthodox world. A leading Orthodox magazine recently published a symposium on whether institutional Orthodoxy had blundered by putting its money on one losing horse and burnt its bridges. I thought that for the sake of our collective political interests, it was vital that one Orthodox leader write a substantial, unabashedly pro-Biden article. Baruch Hashem, the campaign had heard me, as did numerous other powerful voices throughout the Democratic Party in New York, on Capitol Hill, and elsewhere, improving the chances that our community's policy perspectives will be taken seriously and Emir Hashem acted on in what will in fact be a Democratic presidential term. A third reason I wrote was to spotlight issues and principles that concern Orthodox political liberals, but that are rarely part of Orthodox public discourse. This matters because political liberals comprise a good chunk of our communities across the Orthodox American spectrum. The issues that animate them overlap with, but also differ from, the issues important to Republicans. One of those differences is the emphasis on the importance of empirical reality and the hard sciences at the very basis of civil discourse and policy. Prior to the 2016 election, we, RCA Rabbanim, passed a resolution emphasizing exactly that point. And yet, 4 years later, the US is in the middle of a full-blown epistemological crisis, where much of a powerful political party and its supporters have become detached from reality. Our people, which has suffered from so many lies in high places for so long, knows that the opposition to facts and reality is a political red flag. And our Torah tells us that it's a deeply troubling religious problem too. And yet today, many in our community, including prominent leaders, subject objective falsehoods, such as rejected and debunked conspiracy theories relating to the election, magical thinking and erroneous thinking about COVID, lies about vaccines, and a broad failure to recognize climate change and its devastating ongoing and future impacts on the United States, Israel, and all of human civilization. The second important issue for political liberals is to support the principled institutions and norms that define and strengthen American democracy, that have made America one of the most welcoming places in the world, in world history, for Jews and every other group, which our authoritarian and temperate president has relentlessly attacked for 4 years. My articles discuss these and other morally urgent issues as well. These foundational issues cut at the heart of unshakable values for us as Americans and as Jews, and they are the fourth reason that I wrote. They rightly precede any specific policy question. This is why this year's election was, in fact, not merely rhetorically, the most important election of our lifetimes. They are what made Trump's presidency so dangerous and utterly sui generis in demanding rabbinic rejection. My fifth and final sixth reasons for speaking out as a rabbi were also a response to the Orthodox community's overall message, which has been loud and clear, that one's religious identity and political affiliation are, should be, or must be intertwined. In its most extreme form, as heard by large numbers of Orthodox Jews, that message is: supporting Democrats means that one is a non-Orthodox, perhaps not even Jewish, anti-Israel socialist who is disloyal to his people and loves anti-Semites. The extreme version was demonstrated by personally threatening reactions to my public support for, wait for it, the Democratic nominee for president of the United States. I was called a rodef, a moser, a meshumad, and especially lovely, all who concur with renegade Rabbi Kornblau. If they were in the Hanukkah era, they would have been executed by the Orthodox Maccabees. For these things, I filed a police report. Of course, this intertwining that's presently part of pro-Trump Orthodox culture is, Baruch Hashem, usually less extreme. But even more moderate intertwining still damages Orthodoxy and Orthodox Jews. The intertwining damage to Orthodoxy's religious fabric was my fifth reason to write as a rabbi. Some Orthodox Jews are true MAGA supporters and voted for their man with a gusto. Others held their nose. But regardless, many no longer bother to forthrightly and regularly address Trump's demeaning name-calling and denigration of opponents in the violation of the Tzelem Elokim inherent in every human being, his incessant lies and violation of the Divar Sheker Tirchak, which applies to him as well as to us, and the illegal, unethical, and immoral behavior of his administration. Whatever the reasons for omitting or downplaying moral and ethical concerns in the public sphere, we are left with at least four heavy price tags. One, in the public sphere, these omissions, etc., leave the impression that Orthodoxy doesn't care about these issues, damaging our religion's moral authority. Our prophets, our haftarot, rail against political corruption, yet we are silent. Two, for our own characters, our omissions and downplayings inevitably erode our internal sense that the highest Jewish ideal, as Netziv wrote in his introduction to Sefer Bereshit, is to be Yashar, a person who is straight, who has unquestioned integrity, and seeks the welfare of all humanity. Three, the vast majority of American Jewry do not observe halakha, and they are politically liberal. We wish for them to join our communities and observe halakha, yet our intertwining, intentionally or otherwise, has created an enormous socio-political barrier. Finally, some Trump-supporting congregants now hear a rabbi's bread and butter Devar Torah about ethical or immoral improvements as implicitly political. And so this Torah is not taught, or it's carefully edited, or Chalila is dismissed. My sixth and final, most painful reason to speaking out as a rabbi was the damage this intertwining of politics and religion has inflicted upon thousands and thousands of flesh and blood Orthodox human beings who are political liberals. Blaring forth from the community that defines the core of their identity, this intertwining has been, is, and will long continue to be a profoundly painful human and religious crisis with at least 5 tangible effects. People feel ostracized and alienated and have been maligned at Shabbos and Yom Tov tables among their neighbors and friends in their own communities and shuls. Some have actually moved out of communities they once loved or wish they could. Second, some have actually felt relief that the pandemic has provided them with legitimate reasons to stop coming to shul, Halila. Third, and tragically, political tensions are damaging familiar relationships. Colleagues and I have spent countless hours helping people with these issues. Fourth, politically liberal Orthodox Jews have become uncomfortable dating, knowing that the other person will likely hold a political view that they firmly, a political view that they cannot abide. Fifth and finally, many are now uncomfortable with the word Orthodox itself because of its close public association with Trump throughout media in the United States and the Western world. They wonder how they're co-religionists, and seemingly their religion itself has lost its way. But Dafka, as a rabbi and a Jewish leader, I wrote to give voice to all these people, and oh boy, did I hear from them, Hasidic, yeshivish, and modern men, women, rabbis, lay people, young and old. They told me that my articles gave them tremendous religious chizuk by telling them that they are not crazy for opposing Trump. Their Orthodox Jewish ideals are ehrlich and menschlich and lechatchila, and they are not chutz lamachaneh. They are not outside of the camp of Orthodoxy for supporting Biden and Democrats. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, for your very catching words. Rav Efrem, so I want to make one observation before we go on. First of all, Rav, I'm going to give you more time if you need, because we're sort of a little bit unbalanced in our timing. I do want to stress an important point here. Rabbi Goldberg is not representing the Trump side. That's not what we focused on our debate this evening. Rav Efrem made the observation that an Orthodox rabbi should not really support either side. Rav Barry, you spoke very passionately, of course, about why you felt this was a unique situation, and we appreciate that. But I want to make it clear to our viewers, wherever they may be, that this is not a debate between Rabbi Goldberg and Rabbi Kornblau as whom you should vote for. So one should not ascertain that Rabbi Goldberg, even by proxy, is representing either of the candidates. I have a question, but I guess maybe in fairness to the way the time worked out, Rabbi Goldberg, I'll give you a chance to respond a little bit first. I guess the focus I really wanted to be focusing on is what are the scenarios you feel you should speak out, but perhaps in light of the way the time has gone, let you just respond.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I knew I should have had a picture of Dr. Blau on my wall, my wife's principal. I could have gotten some more time out of it. Rav Barry, you packed a lot in, so I'm going to try to remember what I wanted to respond. Essentially, as I anticipated, your core argument, although you broke it down in many segments, is this time it's different. That was the core argument. It's different because of the Jewish media. It's different because of other rabbis taking stands. It's different because of people who feel like victims who don't have a voice. It's different because a certain candidate is so egregious and crosses the line. It's different because the other candidate needs to know that they're Orthodox Jews who like him. You gave a long list of reasons why this time is different. So the first response I have is, everyone will always give that explanation of why this time is different. Before the election with President Obama, there were some who felt very strongly that President Obama went to the church of a blatantly anti-American, anti-Israel pastor, that he was going to enter a deal that would embolden a nation that posed an existential threat to Israel, and many other arguments that were legitimate arguments. And they thought that they were, to quote you, morally urgent. And then, though I shared some of those concerns, I, not to flex, but had a conversation with then Senator Obama about his sitting in the pews of Reverend Wright, which his response was very different than what he wrote right now in his autobiography. But I shared many of those concerns. And even then, I didn't endorse a candidate from the pulpit. Because even though I thought there were some morally urgent questions, I thought it was inappropriate and wrong for a rabbi, particularly a pulpit rabbi, in front of a congregation who are sophisticated, well-read, thoughtful, to tell them how they should think and for whom they should vote. Every election are morally urgent issues on the ballot. For us as observant Jews, among them, I won't say for everyone it's obligated to be number one, but the safety, security, and well-being of the one and only Jewish state, a place of refuge should we ever need it, is among the most morally urgent issues. And one can frame almost any election and the candidates and the policies at stake as being morally urgent. So as I anticipated, your answer essentially is this time was different, and though therefore I agree with you in principle, I had to speak out. But here's my answer. I too am frustrated. I too am bothered. I'm deeply offended, and I'm worried about the worship of President Trump. While I have tremendous gratitude and appreciation for great things that he has done, I think that segments, not all, they're the loudest segments, but I think they're far from the majority of the Orthodox community, even those who voted for him, I think don't fall prey to this issue of worship. Jewish media is an important topic, but it's a distraction from ours. We're talking about Rabbanim, not Jewish media and not Jewish media personalities. So I think that if you and I are equally concerned that we're living in a divisive and polarized political world within the Orthodox community, and there aren't legitimate, reasonable, different conclusions that you can vote in either direction for different candidates, the answer is not to take a political position. The answer is not to tell people who they should and must vote for. That's only contributing to the fundamental problem. The answer is to get up and say that we love a fellow Jew. These are reasonable, legitimate conclusions to come to. One should never judge, come to your decision, and we won't tolerate. We won't allow an environment, we won't allow a climate in which people call each other names, marginalize, people discriminate against fellow Jews for voting differently. We should be preaching the notion of and Shimon Panor. That's our job as rabbis. The moment that we take a position and tell others who, as your originally headline said, who they must vote for, I personally am offended that you told me who I must vote for. Who are you to tell me who I must vote for? I don't know how your congregants felt about that. But I don't think you're entitled to tell me who I must or even who I should vote for. You could tell me who you think and who you're going to vote for, but the headline itself I found offensive. I think taking that position contributes to the problem. It's not the solution. When I wrote my article explaining why I don't think rabbis should be endorsing candidates, I too heard from a wide-ranging and a large group of people. I don't know as many, less, or more than you did, but I too got feedback. We'll always get it from those who agree and don't feel they have a voice. But here's what I thought was the interesting thing. I spent a lot of time wordsmithing my article in order to not signal to anyone who I personally am voting for. And the fascinating thing is how many emails I got from those who were incredulous I could have voted in one direction and those who are outraged I could have voted in the other. And that made me know I did a good job. The fact that I couldn't indicate clearly whom I voted for and that people thought in both directions positioned me to be able to take this position tonight. And tonight I haven't indicated who I voted for. As I say, if you want a cup of coffee with me privately, socially distanced and with masks and safely, I'm happy to share as a private citizen my thoughts, but never as a rabbi. To me, it's an abuse of the pulpit and it's abuse of the rabbinic pen. I think it's a mistake. I also think that to position yourself as the lone voice of an Orthodox rabbi supporting Biden is somewhat disingenuous. A group of great Orthodox Jewish thinkers wrote an article called Sinai, Not Washington, in which they rebuked the Orthodox establishment and said, don't put your eggs in one basket. Rabbi Avi Shafran, who is a spokesperson of Aguda, has clearly indicated his liberal bent under President Obama, which he took heat for his support, and again in the build-up to this election. And while I don't question that you are a minority or that you felt it was important to give others a voice, the notion that it's a lone voice and there was no one else speaking out, I don't think is accurate, I don't think is fair, I don't think is true. And I think that the others are thinkers, and they have positions with the organizations. They're fundamentally different than a rabbi of a congregation, a rabbi of a pulpit, a rabbi of members who need to be able to trust us, confide in us, believe us, and for us not to be able to alienate them and drive them away. And I want to end by asking you a question. I don't know if that's okay. I have to ask our moderator. But I wonder, you felt that this is a morally urgent time. Morally urgent policies, morally urgent circumstances, morally urgent candidate, and therefore you had no choice but to speak out. But you were among the signatories to a letter to Young Israel. When Young Israel's leadership felt that it was morally urgent for Young Israel to weigh in on something, you and some colleagues wrote a letter saying that Young Israel shouldn't be in the business of weighing in on politics. And I wonder what changed. Why were you a voice of opposition and protest to the Young Israel leadership or movement weighing in on politics then when they thought something was morally urgent, but you've decided now that it's morally urgent? And if the answer is that the leadership of Young Israel didn't poll the Young Israel members first, did you poll your congregants before you wrote the article? And before you as a rabbi, who I'm sure in the byline said you're not writing it as the rabbi of the congregation, but nonetheless you can't divorce yourself from that position. How would you have felt if the RCA officers took a vote and decided this candidate is morally urgent, we endorse them, and we therefore came out with that? So I think it's a very slippery slope, a very dangerous line. And I think that while all of your arguments may be true, I'm not even disagreeing with them necessarily. What I'm saying is the conclusion, because of all those arguments, is why we as rabbis should get up and preach love, openness, warmth, respect, disagreeing agreeably, and allowing people to come to their own legitimate and reasonable conclusions without judgment, marginalizing, calling names. That, I think, will contribute to the solution, not contributing to the problem by ourselves taking a position for a specific candidate.
Rev. Barry, I guess what I'll do is allow you to respond, and then I have a question that I want to ask both of you separately. So, Rev. Barry.
I'm going to speak very briefly because I know that I speak longer. Before, very briefly, the pieces that I wrote. Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay. The pieces that I wrote, I did in no way, shape, or form shared from my Bima or to my community. I published them in New Jersey, and I live in Queens. I, in no time, ever projected that point of view directly to my community members. And indeed, my community is such that I was quite confident that whatever feedback I would get directly. I wasn't really concerned about it. And that's why I chose to speak, not in some hypothetical rule, but Lamaisa. Was I in a position to speak? Yes, I was. In terms of the National Council of Young Israel, I never even sent a link to my article to my shul. Nothing, zero. In terms of the National Council of Young Israel, my position and that of 24 other Young Israel shuls, nearly a fifth of its members, was that indeed they had not consulted, and that was widely understood to be the case with the National Council of Young Israel. That's an internal National Council of Young Israel issue. If indeed it had consulted, then let it speak like the Orthodox Union speaks. Let it speak like the RCA speaks, and it will be accountable to all of its members with an internal process that makes sense. They've since heavily pulled back from all of that, and there's been a lot of change.
Okay, thank you both.
Are you, Barry, are you disappointed that the RCA, the OU, and Young Israel didn't come out as you did to tell people they should vote for Biden?
No. I don't think that those large organizations ought to have made that statement. I never thought about it, actually. No, I don't think they ought to have made that statement. I think that the problems that I highlighted are way before the question of endorsement. To me, the issue here is not endorsement, but pre-political issues. How did we get to a situation where we're so politically entwined with political affiliation, voting, and religious identity? And to that end, I think that there's 3 projects that need to happen. I'm happy to elaborate on them, but I'm concerned about the time.
Well, let me do the following.
Do you think that your article untwined them or further intertwined them by a rabbi endorsing a candidate?
So, rabbis, can I interject for a moment? So let me ask one final question to each of you, separate questions, and then I'll have a moment of summing up. As I mentioned to my 2 chaverim before we started this evening, my mother taught me a famous maxim when I assumed the rabbinate, always leaving them wishing you had said more than said less. And I want to be careful of our time, although I think the discussion this evening has been incredibly instructive. And I've been looking at the comments coming in, and I think many people are paying close attention to your points of view and your wise words. So I guess let's pick up on the point that you just been raising, the 2 of you both been raising, and the nature of the intertwining between politics and religious identity. So I guess for Rav Efrem, in your sense, how do you really address moral issues that are related to politics while staying apolitical? What is the formula for doing that effectively? And I guess for Rav Barry, if you're saying that they are too intertwined, how do you prepare to decouple them? The question for both of you. Rav Efrem, the question to you, and then Rav Barry, the question to you.
Thank you. I alluded to it before. I think that our job is divrei chachama benachas nishmam. We should raise the issues, the moral issues, but in the abstract. We should raise them conceptually. We should raise them in broad strokes about what we should care about, why we should care about it, what the Torah informs us on those issues, and then leave it to our members to determine which candidate, which party, which policy will best align itself with and follow up on what we as Torah Jews, assuming that we can even consolidate to such a narrow thing to say this is what the Torah wants. The Torah itself is so broad and so diverse and allows for such diverse opinions that I'm not even sure that we can absolutely say with certainty what the Torah wants on a given issue. So I think, first of all, honestly, I think that our community and the greater Jewish community has significant issues for us to be addressing about feeling Hashem in our lives, leading inspired Jewish lives, Jewish continuity, assimilation, intermarriage, or our own graduates within the Orthodox and modern Orthodox community continuing to lead inspired lives. There are no shortage of topics which are critically urgent for us to talk about that others are not talking about. You're not going to turn on Fox, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, not even Ben Shapiro is going to talk about those issues which are of critical importance and are the primary responsibility for rabbis to talk about. They need us to talk about them. And I think the moment we start talking about those other issues, we're unlikely to change minds. And even if we think, no, I'm just talking about immigration, that we came from Mitzrayim and we have to be sensitive, immigration's important, the people who want to hear it one way will hear it one way. Want to hear it the other way will hear it the other way. And no one will hear what we're saying. So who did we really speak to? So I would avoid the hot button words, immigration and climate control and environment, not because they're not important, but because from the pulpit, there are many other things that we and we alone are going to speak about or should be speaking about or need to try to move the needle on. And I don't think we should be using our time and our voice on those other issues, which are unlikely to change opinions. If we are because we think they're critically important, then I would speak about the issue and not about the people and let our congregants, who I trust and who are wise and smart, and most of them are smarter than I, to be able to come to their own conclusions.
Barry, back to the question that I asked you, if you're concerned about the coupling, how do we decouple the two, the religious identity and political issues?
So the first piece is that unfortunately I felt the need to push back against the public discourse. I think that's the first step in decoupling, to say that there is actually another perspective. Some guy, if a teacher in Brooklyn literally doesn't have any other perspective to share, then that right there is a problem. So that's number one. I wholly agree with almost all the priorities that you mentioned, and in terms of the that Rav Efrem mentioned, and the importance of avoiding political type language and key buzzwords in rabbinic speech in general. Regarding the broader issue of disentangling, now that there's been a big pushback, the people have been felt validated, which was a big deal. I think that indeed we have to step back to pre-political issues about what values and what morals and what positions that we collectively as the Orthodox community are taking There are large numbers of Jews who are very dissatisfied with the sorts of things that we're prioritizing in our public face. Willy-nilly, we have a public face, and to withdraw rabbinic action from that area doesn't make any sense. We indeed need to talk about the broad values, and eventually, and not specific policies, but which values, which even issues are we talking about? Those things themselves are things that are subject to political dispute, and we need to talk about all of them.
Okay, so the truth is I appreciate both of your comments this evening. I think I'll make two observations, and then if either of you want to have one last comment, I will give you the floor, then I'd like to sum up. One observation is I think first of all, it's been a very spirited discussion to this point, and I want to re-emphasize that both individuals are coming, representing their viewpoints with a great deal of dignity and articulating them with great clarity. And at the end of the day, what was very interesting to me was to hear both of you say that the key really is, Barry felt this was a unique exception. Rav Efrem felt that it was not warranted the case, but both of them felt that the key issue was really to talk about the underlying issues. And that really is what both of you felt very strongly. And I know both of you would do in your own pulpits, and both of you do together and in different contexts. I thought that was very important. On a very light note, in one of the comments, you will both figure this out offline. There was one gentleman who wrote in that he was the only person who is a member of both congregations. The two of you have to figure out who that congregant is, who is a congregant of both of yours. Do either of you want to have one last comment? Rav Goldberg, one last comment. I started with you. I'll give you the chance to end. Any one last comment you'd like to add?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Rav Binny, again. Thank you to Rabbi Strauchler. And most of all, thank you to Rav Barry. And I want to end by saying this. Rav Barry, my heart goes out when you describe sort of how lonely or isolated you felt, or the need to be validated or to validate others. That makes me sad. That's a sad description of where the Orthodox world is, that people who hold certain positions feel so marginalized or isolated. And I don't want to minimize that in any way. I think it's important for us to work towards that goal and of ensuring that nobody feels that way. And while we may disagree on what is the best strategy or way to uncouple or unwind the politics and religion and enable diverse opinions within the Jewish community, within our shuls, I do want to say that I feel bad both for what you described of how you felt, certainly the names that you were called, which are horrifically unjustified, intolerable, unacceptable, and anyone who would reduce themselves to calling you such a name has no business contributing to any of these conversations. So I want to, very important to say that to you. And as I said, I hope that we can work together as this discussion, not a debate. Ultimately, we share the same perspective, which is a goal of ensuring that our shuls, our communities, are places that people can hold diverse views, and it's important to diversify and hold diverse views and allow people to reach them in a legitimate way.
Barry?
I'll leave Rabbi Efrem with the last word.
So I want to thank my two esteemed colleagues and good friends, Rabbi Kornblau and Rabbi Efrem Goldberg.
And I thank everybody also.
I also want to thank Rabbi Strauchler for really being the brains behind the operation, set everything up. Again, Rabbi Kornblau for your leadership as the head of the RCA. I think both Rav Goldberg and Rav Kornblau, I'm not flashing your contact information on the screen, but I'm sure both of you would be happy to have cups of coffee, social distance with anyone who'd like to continue with both of them. These are really two of the leaders of our community. We're very fortunate to hear from you both. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Live the top.